They called him the executioner of soul. Sang-hun didn't negotiate. He didn't forgive. Where other men had hearts, he had a ledger. And every debt was paid in blood. His mansion was a cathedral of fear, and his word was gospel. Rule number 1. No strangers. Ever. But on a rain-soaked Wednesday night, Nellie Renault, his terrified maid, had run out of choices. She brought the only family she had left, her grandmother Michelle Guzman, into the viper's nest. The mansion's iron gates groaned open. Rain hammered the marble foyer like bullets. Nellie's breath caught in her throat as she heard them. Footsteps descending the grand staircase. Measured. Deliberate. Final. Sang-hun appeared at the top of the stairs, his knuckles still bruised from the business meeting he'd just concluded in the East Wing. His eyes swept over the huddled figures in the entrance hall, 2 massive guards flanking them, ready for the order. Nellie pulled her grandmother close, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the word that would seal their fate. But the word never came. Instead, she heard something that shattered reality itself, the sharp intake of breath, the rustle of an expensive suit as a body dropped. When Nellie opened her eyes, the most feared man in Korea wasn't standing. He was on his knees, forehead nearly touching the floor, shoulders trembling. "Mrs. Guzman," he whispered, his voice cracking like breaking ice. "You found me." Flashback 16 hours earlier. Nellie's phone shattered the 2 a.m. silence of the servants' wing with a sound like a scream. Her blood turned cold when she saw the name. Mercy Hill's Extended Care. "Ms. Renault." The administrator's voice was tight with panic. "The building inspector just red-tagged us. Black mold through the entire structure. We're evacuating tonight. You need to come get your grandmother immediately. We have nowhere to place her." The phone slipped through Nellie's fingers, clattering against the nightstand. She had nowhere. Her apartment had been condemned 3 weeks ago. Same reason, different building. She'd been living in this cramped staff room ever since, grateful for a roof, terrified of every shadow. And now this. She threw on clothes and ran into the storm. By the time she reached Mercy Hills, residents were being wheeled out into the rain, social workers shouting over the downpour. Michelle sat near the entrance in her wheelchair, looking impossibly small, clutching her worn Bible and a faded photograph. "Baby girl," Michelle murmured, eyes clouded with confusion. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe, Grandma," Nellie lied, her stomach knotting. "I promise." The drive back to the mansion felt like a descent into hell. Every red light was a sentencing. Every mile brought them closer to the house where strangers didn't just get turned away. They disappeared. 3 months ago, a lost courier had rung the service bell by mistake. He'd left in a body bag. Nellie parked in the service alley behind the kitchen, her hands shaking so violently she could barely pull the key from the ignition. She helped Michelle into the wheelchair, supporting her frail grandmother as they crept through the back entrance. The kitchen was mercifully dark. The other staff wouldn't arrive until 5 a.m. "Just for tonight," Nellie whispered to herself like a prayer, like a spell. "Just until I figure something out." She settled Michelle in her tiny room, waited until her grandmother's breathing deepened into sleep, then slipped back into the hallway. She had 4 guest suites to prepare before dawn, Mr. Sang-hun's orders. No exceptions, no excuses. She worked like a woman possessed, her mind spinning through impossible solutions. Maybe there was another facility. Maybe she could. A sound stopped her heart mid-beat. Footsteps. Slow. Uneven. Coming from the direction of the servants' quarters. No. No. Nellie dropped her cleaning supplies and ran. If you watched to this point, please subscribe and stay with the channel. More stories like this are coming. The mansion had rules. Not the kind printed in employee handbooks or whispered during orientation. The kind that lived in the air itself, thick and suffocating, like the scent of gun oil and expensive cologne. Sang-hun's voice cut through the morning assembly with surgical precision. "When I say something once, I expect it to be engraved on your bones." 30 staff members stood in perfect lines across the marble foyer, backs rigid, eyes forward. Not one dared to breathe too loudly. He descended the grand staircase slowly, deliberately, each footfall echoing like a judge's gavel. His suit was immaculate charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, not a thread out of place. But his knuckles told a different story. Fresh bruises. Dried blood along the ridges. Rule number 1, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembly like a blade. No strangers enter these gates. Not delivery drivers. Not repairmen. Not lost tourists asking for directions. He paused at the bottom step. And certainly not your friends. Your family. Your lovers. A new maid, barely 3 days on staff, made the mistake of shifting her weight. Sang-hun's eyes locked onto her instantly. She froze, color draining from her face. Do you have a question? His tone was silk wrapped around iron. And no, sir. Good. He resumed his circuit around the room. This mansion is not a home. It is a fortress. The moment you blur that line, the moment you think the rules don't apply to you, you become a liability. And I don't keep liabilities on payroll. Behind him, his head of security, a boulder of a man named Park, stood with arms crossed, a visual punctuation marked to every threat. Nellie Renault stood in the third row, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd heard the stories. The courier who'd wandered into the garden and never wandered anywhere again. The accountant who'd tried to embezzle and was found 3 days later in the Han River. The previous head maid who'd gossiped to a reporter and simply vanished. Rule number 2, Sang-hun continued. What happens in this house stays in this house. You don't talk to journalists. You don't talk to police. You don't talk to your priest, your therapist, or your diary. His eyes glinted like black diamonds. The only confessional you need is my office, and I promise you, absolution is not guaranteed. A nervous laugh almost escaped someone's throat but died instantly. Rule number 3. Loyalty is not requested. It is required. You work for me, you breathe for me, and if necessary. He stopped directly in front of the assembly, letting the silence complete the sentence. Park stepped forward with a black folder, handing it to Sang-hun with military precision. He opened it, scanning the contents with the casual interest of a man reading a menu. Kim Ji-woo, he called out. A young man in the back row stiffened. Sir, you're being transferred to the Busan operation. Effective immediately. Relief and terror ward on the man's face. Transfer could mean promotion. Could also mean disposal. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Sang-hun closed the folder with a snap that sounded like breaking bones. Dismissed. The staff dispersed like smoke, silent and swift. Only Nellie remained a moment too long, watching the executioner of Seoul return to his throne at the top of the stairs. She didn't know that in 16 hours, she would break every single one of his rules. The rain was a living thing that night, clawing at the mansion's windows like it wanted to get in. Or maybe it was trying to warn Nellie to stay out. She killed the engine 2 blocks away and coasted into the service alley on momentum alone. The wheelchair barely fit through the gap between her beat-up sedan and the dumpster. Every scrape of metal on concrete sounded like a gunshot in the darkness. Where are we, baby? Michelle's voice was soft, confused, wrapped in the fog of her fading memory. Somewhere safe, Grandma. Just hold on. Nellie's hands trembled as she helped her grandmother from the car. The old woman felt impossibly light, like she was already half ghost. The service entrance was never locked. Sang-hun believed in convenience for his staff and absolute terror as a security measure. No one was stupid enough to use it for anything unauthorized. Until tonight. Nellie wedged the door open with her hip, maneuvering the wheelchair through the kitchen. The industrial refrigerators hummed their midnight song. Stainless steel gleamed under emergency lighting. Everything in Sang-hun's world was cold, sharp, unforgiving. The servants' quarters were tucked in the mansion's east wing, a forgotten afterthought connected by a narrow hallway that smelled of industrial cleaner and old regrets. Nellie's room was barely larger than a closet, a single bed, a dresser, a mirror that had seen better decades. This is cozy, Michelle murmured, though her eyes were already closing. The evacuation had drained her, left her a husk of the fierce woman who'd raised Nellie in a Brooklyn walk-up. Nellie settled her grandmother onto the bed, tucking the thin blanket around her shoulders. Michelle's fingers found the photograph she always carried, a faded image of a young boy with frightened eyes and bruised cheeks. She'd kept it for 30 years. This picture of a child she'd sheltered for 3 months before child services took him away. "My good boy," Michelle whispered, pressing the photograph to her chest. "I wonder if he remembers me." "I'm sure he does, Grandma." Nellie's throat tightened. She'd heard this story 100 times. The runaway orphan in New York. The alley behind Michelle's building. The way she'd fed him, clothed him, taught him that kindness still existed in the world. The boy's name had been Min Song-hun. Michelle had called him Sonny. Nellie checked her watch. 3:47 a.m. The morning staff would arrive at 5. She had exactly 73 minutes to make this room invisible, to erase any trace that someone unauthorized was breathing the same air as the executioner of soul. She stuffed Michelle's overnight bag into the back of her closet, shoved the wheelchair into the corner behind her winter coats. The room still felt wrong, too crowded, too warm with human presence. "Just for tonight," Nellie whispered again, the lie growing stale on her tongue. "I'll figure something out tomorrow." But tomorrow was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had guest suites to prepare, floors to polish, the endless machinery of Sang-hun's empire to maintain. She pressed a kiss to her grandmother's forehead. The old woman was already asleep, snoring softly, and slipped back into the hallway. The mansion's silence pressed against her eardrums like deep water. Somewhere above, Sang-hun was awake in his study. She could feel his presence like a storm system, dark and heavy and ready to break. Nellie grabbed her cleaning cart and got to work, scrubbing away evidence of her own fear. The summons came at 6:47 a.m., delivered by Park's granite fist pounding on Nellie's door. "Main hall. Now." Those 2 words carried the weight of a death sentence. Nellie's blood turned to ice water. Behind her, Michelle stirred on the bed, blinking awake in confusion. "Baby? What's all that noise?" "Stay here," Nellie whispered, her voice barely functional. "Don't make a sound. Please, Grandma." But it was already too late. The main hall had been transformed into a courtroom. Every member of the household staff stood in rigid formation along the walls. Maids, drivers, gardeners, security personnel. 30 pairs of eyes, all carefully averted, all pretending they couldn't see what was about to happen. Sang-hun stood at the top of the grand staircase like a king on his throne. He wasn't wearing his usual suit. This was something worse, a black tactical vest over a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked with old scars and new violence. He just returned from somewhere that required bullets instead of words. "Nellie Renault." His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. The syllables fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of terror. "Step forward." Her legs moved on autopilot, carrying her to the center of the marble floor. The space felt vast, infinite, a killing field disguised as architecture. "How long have you worked for me?" 6 months, sir." "And in those 6 months, have my rules ever been unclear?" Her mouth was a desert. "No, sir." "Then perhaps you can explain." He descended 3 steps, slowly, each footfall a countdown. "Why my head of security just informed me that there is an unauthorized person sleeping in the servants' quarters." The room held its breath. "Sir, I can explain." "I didn't ask for explanations." His eyes were black holes swallowing all light, all hope. "I asked for obedience. And you have given me betrayal." He nodded once. Park and another guard, a man called Choi who had hands like sledgehammers, moved forward with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd done this before. "Wait." Nellie's voice cracked. "Please, she's my grandmother. She had nowhere else to go, the nursing home." "I don't care if she's the Virgin Mary." Sang-hun's tone never changed, never heated. That was somehow worse than screaming. "No strangers. Ever." Those words were simple enough for a child to understand. Park grabbed Nellie's right arm. Choi took her left. Their grips were iron, unyielding, bruising through her uniform sleeves. "Make an example," Sang-hun said simply. "Front gates. The entire household watches. They dragged her backward, her shoes squealing against marble. She didn't fight, fighting would make it worse. But her body betrayed her anyway. Lungs heaving, tears streaming. A sound escaping her throat that was barely human. The staff parted like a sea, making way for the procession. "Please," Nellie sobbed, the word dissolving into nothing. "Please, she's 83, she's sick, she." The main doors swung open. Rain-soaked morning air rushed in, cold and final. The gates were 50 yards away across the courtyard. They might as well have been on the moon. And then, a sound behind them. Soft, unsteady, footsteps. Park stopped mid-stride. Choi's grip loosened just slightly. The entire household turned as one, a synchronized movement of disbelief. Michelle Guzman stood in the doorway of the servants' wing, leaning heavily on the frame, her silver hair catching the dawn light like a halo. She wore a faded nightgown and house slippers, looking impossibly small, impossibly fragile. But her eyes were sharp, clear, cutting through the fog of dementia like a blade through silk. And they locked directly onto Sang-hun. Time didn't stop. It shattered. Sang-hun's face, that mask of ice that had sentenced men to death without a tremor, cracked like fractured glass. The color drained from his skin, leaving him corpse-pale under the chandelier light. His lips moved, forming a word that had no sound. Then again, stronger, broken. Halmoni. Michelle took one shuffling step forward, squinting through the distance and the years. Her hand rose to her chest, fingers finding the photograph tucked in her nightgown pocket, the same photograph she'd carried for 3 decades like a talisman. "Sonny." Her voice was a whisper that somehow filled the entire hall. "My Sonny? Is that you?" The guards holding Nellie exchanged glances of pure confusion. Park's grip slackened completely. 30 staff members stood frozen, witnesses to something impossible, something that violated every law of the universe they understood. Sang-hun moved then, not with the predatory grace they all knew, but like a puppet with cut strings. He descended the remaining stairs in 3 stumbling steps, crossed half the distance to Michelle before his knees simply gave out. The executioner of soul dropped like a stone. Not a casual genuflection. Not a calculated gesture of respect. A full deep bow, forehead nearly touching the marble, shoulders hunched, hands pressed flat against the floor. The bow of a child before a parent. The bow of a sinner before salvation. Halmoni. His voice shattered on the word, splintered into pieces that could never be reassembled. "You're alive. You're alive. I looked for you. I looked." The tactical vest, the rolled sleeves, the blood still fresh under his fingernails, all of it meaningless now. He was no longer the devil of soul. He was a boy who'd been lost for 30 years and had just found his way home. Michelle moved forward, her house slippers whispering against marble. The entire household parted for her without conscious thought, creating a corridor between her and the kneeling man who ruled their lives with terror. She reached him, placed one weathered hand on his head. Her fingers trembled as they touched his hair, expensively cut, perfectly styled, so different from the matted, filthy tangles of the child she'd washed in her Brooklyn bathtub. "You got so tall," she murmured, and there were tears in her voice, in her eyes, running down her lined cheeks. "My good boy. You got so tall." Sang-hun's shoulders shook. A sound emerged from him that no one in that room had ever heard, never even imagined was possible. A sob, raw and broken, the sound of 3 decades of grief finally finding release. Park stood like a statue, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something dangerously close to fear. The other guards exchanged glances that asked the same silent question. "What do we do?" Nellie remained frozen between Choi and the door, her own tears forgotten, watching the most powerful man in Korea weep at her grandmother's feet. "I thought you were dead," Sang-hun whispered into the marble. "They told me you were dead." "The case worker," she said. "Hush now." Michelle's hand moved to his cheek, lifting his face so she could see him properly. "I'm here. I'm right here." For the first time in 15 years, the mansion knew silence that wasn't born of fear. It was born of grace. Brooklyn, New York. July 1995. The alley behind Michelle's building smelled like rotting garbage and broken dreams. It was the kind of place where hope went to die quietly, away from the streetlights and the tourists. The boy had been there for 3 days before she noticed him. He was maybe 9 years old, all sharp angles and jutting bones, with eyes that had already seen too much. His clothes were rags held together by dirt and desperation. He'd made a nest behind the dumpster, surrounded by flattened cardboard boxes that did nothing against the summer heat or the rats. Michelle had been taking out her trash when she saw him rifling through the bags, shoving something moldy into his mouth with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd forgotten what food was supposed to taste like. "Child," she'd said softly, not wanting to spook him, "when's the last time you ate something that wasn't garbage?" He'd bolted like a wild animal, disappearing into the maze of fire escapes and shadows. But she'd seen his face. Seen the bruises, old ones yellowed at the edges, fresh ones blooming purple across his cheekbones. Seen the burns on his forearms, perfectly circular, like someone had used him as an ashtray. She left a plate of food by the dumpster that night. Gone by morning. She did it again the next night. And the next. On the 4th night he was waiting when she came out, pressed against the brick wall like he wanted to melt into it. "You don't have to be afraid," Michelle said, setting down rice and chicken, real food still warm. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't move until she'd gone back inside. But through her kitchen window she watched him eat, watched him cry silently into his hands afterward, like kindness was something he'd forgotten existed. It took 2 weeks before he let her get close. 3 weeks before he told her his name, Min Song-hun, but the way he said it sounded like a curse, like something that came with too much pain attached. "You can call me Sunny," she'd said, trying the name out in her warm melodic accent. "That's easier on my tongue, baby." He'd nodded, and for the first time, something almost like a smile crossed his face. She smuggled him into her apartment that night. A violation of her lease, her safety, every bit of common sense she had. Her husband had been dead 5 years. Her daughter was grown and gone. The apartment felt too big, too empty, too full of ghosts. Sunny filled it with life. She fed him, bathed him, scrubbing away layers of street grime until she found the boy underneath. Taught him English, sitting with him at her kitchen table while he struggled through picture books meant for toddlers, his pride warring with his hunger to learn. "You're a good boy," she'd tell him every night, tucking him into the couch that served as his bed. "Don't let anyone tell you different." He'd been with her 3 months when they came. Social services. A caseworker with dead eyes and a clipboard, flanked by 2 police officers who looked at Michelle like she was the criminal. Unregistered minor. Unlicensed foster care. "Ma'am, you're in violation." Sunny had fought like a demon, screaming in Korean and broken English, clawing at the officers' arms as they dragged him toward the door. "Halmoni! Halmoni, please." Michelle had run after them, all the way to the squad car, pressing the photograph into his hands through the window, a picture she'd taken of him smiling over birthday cake, the first birthday he'd ever celebrated. "I'll find you," she'd promised, tears streaming down her face. "I'll find you, baby. I promise." The car pulled away. She never saw him again. Until now. By noon, the entire mansion had been turned upside down. Michelle Guzman, all 5'2" and 90 pounds of her, had claimed the master suite on the 3rd floor. Not asked. Claimed. She'd taken one look at Sang-hun's massive bedroom, all black leather and chrome, cold as a morgue, and declared it depressing as a funeral home. "Get me some color in here," she'd ordered, pointing at Park with her wooden cane like a general deploying troops. "And curtains. Real curtains, not these sad prison blinds. And flowers. Living ones." Park had looked to Sang-hun for guidance. The executioner of Seoul, still red-eyed from crying, had simply nodded. "Whatever Halmoni wants." By evening, interior designers were running through the mansion like their lives depended on it, which, given Sang-hun's reputation, they probably did. Yellow curtains. A floral bedspread. Framed photographs of strangers who looked happy, because Michelle said, "A room needs joy in it." Nellie watched from the doorway, still processing the fact that she wasn't dead, Wasn't banished, wasn't even fired. She'd been promoted. Family liaison, Sang-hun had called it, though his voice had cracked on the word family, like it was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. The real shock came at dinner. Sang-hun had tried to eat in his study, as he always did, alone, door locked, surrounded by screens showing security feeds and offshore accounts. Michelle had appeared in the doorway like a vengeful ghost, cane tapping against the hardwood. "What do you think you're doing?" He'd looked up, confused. "Eating. Not in here, you're not. Family eats at the table. Together. Halmoni, I have work. The work can wait. Move." And the devil of soul had moved. Now he sat at the head of the dining table, a piece of furniture that had never actually been used for dining, while Michelle loaded his plate with vegetables. Actual vegetables. Broccoli, carrots, things that had never touched his meticulously planned, protein-heavy meals. "Eat," Michelle commanded. "I don't like broccoli." "You're 39 years old, Sonny. Stop acting like you're 5. Park stood in the corner, face carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him, wide with disbelief, watching his terrifying boss get scolded over vegetables. "And sit up straight," Michelle continued, rapping her knuckles against the table. "You're slouching like a street thug. I didn't raise you to have the posture of a question mark." Sang-hun straightened automatically, muscle memory from 3 months in Brooklyn overriding 15 years of being untouchable. "Yes, Halmoni." Nellie, sitting 3 chairs down, bit her lip to keep from laughing. This man who'd ordered her dragged to the gate 6 hours ago, was being reduced to a scolded child by an 83-year-old woman with a wooden cane and an iron will. "And another thing," Michelle said, pointing her fork at him like a weapon. "This language you use. Eliminate. Neutralize. Take care of. You think I don't know what that means? You think I'm stupid? No, Halmoni, You want to talk about your business, you use proper words. You don't hide behind coded nonsense like some kind of coward." Sang-hun's jaw tightened. For a moment the mask slipped back into place, the cold, calculating killer who'd built an empire on fear and blood. "My business requires discretion. Your business requires you to remember you're a human being, not a monster." Michelle's voice softened just slightly. "I know what you've become, Sonny. I'm not blind, but you don't get to forget what you were. Not while I'm alive." The fight drained out of him like water through a sieve. He picked up his fork, stabbed a piece of broccoli, and ate it without another word of protest. Park would later tell the other guards that he'd witnessed a miracle that night. The executioner of soul, defeated by a grandmother and a vegetable. The photograph hit the darknet at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't much. Grainy security footage captured by a traffic camera 3 blocks from the mansion. But it showed enough. Sang-hun, the executioner of soul, bowing on the marble floor. An old woman's hand on his head. His shoulders shaking with what could only be tears. In the underworld, weakness was blood in the water. And the sharks were already circling. Kwon Jae-sung, known only as the Viper, saw the image on his encrypted tablet while having his morning espresso in a penthouse overlooking Gangnam. He studied it for 3 minutes in silence, then smiled, the kind of smile that preceded funerals. "So," he said to his second-in-command, a scar-faced enforcer named Mun. "The devil has a heart after all." Mun leaned over his shoulder, studying the photograph. "An old woman. Looks like a grandmother. Not just any grandmother." The Viper zoomed in on Michelle's face, grainy pixels resolving into weathered features and silver hair. His grandmother, apparently, which means Sang-hun, our untouchable, emotionless monster, has finally given us exactly what we've been waiting 15 years to find. A pressure point. Better. The Viper set down his espresso with the delicate precision of a surgeon placing a scalpel. A kill shot. Sang-hun had been a problem for too long. He'd consolidated too much territory, absorbed too many operations, choked out too many competitors. The Viper's organization had been hemorrhaging profit for 3 years, watching helplessly as the executioner expanded his empire like a cancer. They tried conventional approaches. Ambushes, Sang-hun had walked through them like a ghost, leaving bodies in his wake. Bribes. His people were too terrified to betray him. Negotiations. He didn't negotiate, he dictated. But this changed everything. Surveillance, the Viper ordered, his voice sharp as cut glass. I want eyes on that mansion 24/7. I want to know when the old woman breathes. I want her routine, her vulnerabilities, her medical conditions. Everything. Mun nodded, already typing into his phone. And then we remind Sang-hun that kings fall hardest when they care about something more than their throne. The plan crystallized over the next 48 hours. The Viper's network, smaller than Sang-hun's, but more vicious, more willing to break the unwritten rules that even criminals respected, went into motion like a well-oiled machine. They identified the mansion's blind spots, 3 cameras that hadn't been updated in 6 months. They mapped the guard rotations, found the 17-minute gap during the shift change at 2 a.m. They tracked Michelle's movements, learned that she took a walk in the garden every afternoon at 3, accompanied only by Nellie. We don't kill her immediately, the Viper instructed during the final briefing. His inner circle 8 men, all handpicked for their particular brand of cruelty, sat around the conference table like a jury preparing to deliver a verdict. We take her. Let Sang-hun know we have her. Let him feel what it's like to be powerless. And then, Mun asked. The Viper's smile widened. And then we make him watch while we erase the only thing he's ever loved. And when he's broken, when he's finally human enough to bleed properly, we put a bullet in his head and take everything he built. He raised his glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light like captured fire. Gentlemen, the executioner's reign ends this week. They drank to death and opportunity, to the fall of an empire, to blood that would soon run through the streets of Seoul like a river. The attack was scheduled for Friday, 3 days away. They came at 2:17 a.m., during the shift change, just as the Viper had planned. The first explosion took out the east gate, a flash of light and thunder that shattered every window on the ground floor. Sang-hun was up before the echo faded, weapon in hand, tactical instincts overriding 3 days of domestic softness. Halmoni! His voice tore through the hallway as he sprinted toward the master suite. Behind him, Park and the security team were already mobilizing, but they were scattered, disorganized, caught flat-foot by an enemy who'd done their homework. Michelle stood in her doorway wrapped in her yellow robe, eyes sharp despite the chaos. Sonny, what's happening? Get back inside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. He grabbed her shoulders, gentle despite the urgency. Do you understand? She nodded, but before she could retreat, Nellie appeared from the servants' wing, barefoot and terrified. The back entrance. There are men coming through. Gunfire erupted from the main hall. Not the controlled burst of security protocols, but the wild spray of an assault, bullets chewing through marble and plaster and priceless art that suddenly meant nothing at all. Sang-hun moved on instinct, pushing both women behind him as shadows poured into the mansion like a flood. The Viper's men, 8 of them, all masked, all armed with military-grade weapons that had no business in civilian hands. Park went down first, took 2 rounds to the chest before he could even raise his weapon. The other guards followed, outgunned and overwhelmed, the mansion's elaborate security system useless against an enemy who'd studied every weakness. Sang-hun fired back, dropping one attacker, then another, moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd been dancing with death since childhood. But there were too many, the angles were wrong, and he was being driven backward toward the staircase, away from weapons, away from reinforcements, away from Michelle. The old woman, someone shouted in Korean. Viper wants her alive. Everything crystallized in that moment. The photograph on the dark net, the surveillance he'd been too distracted to notice, the trap closing around the only light he'd found in 30 years of darkness. 2 of them broke away from the main group, moving toward the master suite with surgical efficiency. Sang-hun turned, abandoning his defensive position, throwing himself back up the stairs with reckless desperation. He reached them in the hallway, drove a knife into the first man's throat before he could react. The second one was faster, raised his weapon, finger tightening on the trigger. Michelle stepped out of her room. Time fractured into slow motion. The barrel swinging toward her. Her eyes widening, not with fear but with recognition, with the terrible understanding of what was about to happen. Nellie screaming something that had no words. Sang-hun didn't think. Didn't calculate. Didn't weigh odds or outcomes or tactical advantages. He just moved. His body collided with Michelle's, spinning her away from the line of fire. The bullet that would have torn through her chest found him instead, punching through his left shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer, spraying blood across the yellow curtain she'd insisted on installing. He felt the impact more than the pain, his arm going numb, his weapon clattering to the floor. But his momentum carried them both into the master suite, and his right hand, still functional, slammed the door shut. The lock clicked. Solid oak, reinforced steel core. It would hold. For a minute. Maybe two. Sang-hun collapsed against the door, his vision tunneling, blood soaking through his shirt in rhythm with his heartbeat. Michelle was beside him, her hands pressing against the wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen violence before, who'd patched up a different boy in a different life. "Sonny," she whispered, and there were tears on her cheeks. "You foolish, foolish boy." Outside, the gunfire continued, but it was changing now, more organized, coordinated. Park's backup team finally arriving. The Viper's men retreating. Their primary objective failed. "Had to," Sang-hun managed, his voice weak but certain. "Couldn't let them. Couldn't lose you again." Michelle's hand found his face, held him like she'd held him 3 decades ago in a Brooklyn apartment that smelled of rice and safety. "I know, baby. I know." The doctor finished stitching Sang-hun's shoulder at 4:32 a.m., working in the mansion's surprisingly well-equipped medical suite while Michelle watched like a hawk from the corner. "Clean through," the doctor reported. His hand steady despite having been summoned at gunpoint. "Missed the bone, missed the major arteries. He'll need physical therapy, but he'll recover fully." "Of course he will," Michelle said, as if biology itself wouldn't dare defy her. He's survived worse. By dawn, the mansion had been locked down tighter than a military installation. Additional security, vetted personally by Sang-hun from his hospital bed. New protocols. New cameras. The Viper had exposed every weakness, and Sang-hun wouldn't make that mistake twice. But first there was a debt to settle. The Viper's location came through an informant at 9 a.m. A penthouse in Gangnam, fortified but not impregnable. Sang-hun wanted to lead the strike himself, tried to rise from the bed despite his injury. Michelle had stopped him with a single look. "You're not going anywhere, Sonny. Let your people handle it." For the first time in 15 years, he delegated vengeance. Park, wounded but alive, wearing a vest that had saved his life, led the team personally. They were efficient, professional. By noon, the Viper's organization had been dismantled, his assets seized, his inner circle scattered to the wind. The Viper himself had been given a choice: exile or elimination. He'd chosen exile, fleeing to Malaysia with nothing but his life and the clothes on his back. Sang-hun would have killed him. The old Sang-hun, the executioner, would have made it slow and public and terrifying. But Michelle had asked him to show mercy. "You're not that boy anymore," she'd said, sitting beside his bed, her weathered hand wrapped around his uninjured one. "You don't have to keep proving you're a monster. I already know who you really are." So the Viper lived. Broken, humiliated, but alive. 3 weeks later, Sang-hun was cleared for light activity. He found Michelle in the garden, tending to flowers that hadn't existed a month ago, transforming his fortress of fear into something that almost resembled a home. Nellie sat nearby, no longer a maid but family, reading aloud from a book while her grandmother listened and pruned roses with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Sang-hun approached slowly, his shoulders still stiff, still reminding him every day of the choice he'd made. The choice to be human instead of invincible. "Halmoni," he said softly. Michelle looked up, smiled. The same smile she'd given him 30 years ago when he'd successfully read his first full sentence in English. Pride mixed with love, uncomplicated and pure. Come sit, Sonny. You look tired. He sat beside her on the bench, this man who'd built an empire on fear and blood, and let his head rest against her shoulder like the child he'd once been. I tried to find you, he whispered, the confession he'd been carrying for decades finally finding air. After they took me. When I got older, when I had resources, I looked everywhere. The building had been condemned. Everyone said you'd moved away or died or... I looked for you too. Michelle's voice was gentle, sad. But they wouldn't tell me anything. Sealed records. Privacy laws. I wrote letters to every agency I could find, but they all said the same thing. The boy I'd sheltered didn't legally exist. Because he'd been trafficked, smuggled into the country by people who'd seen him as merchandise. No papers, no trail, no identity beyond the one he'd built himself from violence and necessity. I never forgot you, Sang-hun said. I know, baby. I kept your picture. Waited. Prayed you were somewhere safe, somewhere good. She touched his face, traced the scar along his jaw that hadn't existed when he was 9. I guess I got half my prayer answered. They sat in silence, surrounded by flowers and the gentle rustle of pages as Nellie read. The mansion's security system hummed in the background, ever vigilant, but somehow the walls felt less like a prison now. Am I? Sang-hun hesitated, the question catching in his throat. Am I still your good boy? Michelle was quiet for a long moment, and he braced himself for judgment, for the condemnation he'd spent 30 years earning. Then she smiled, squeezed his hand, and said the words that rewrote his entire existence. You've always been my good boy, Sonny. Always. The devil of soul, the executioner, the monster who'd built a throne from bones. He broke apart in that garden, shattered into something raw and real and finally, impossibly, at peace. Nellie pretended not to notice the tears. She just kept reading, her voice steady and warm, filling the silence with stories that had happy endings. For the first time in 30 years, Sang-hun believed that maybe, just maybe, his story could have one too. If you enjoyed this story and felt the tension, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. And more Mafia stories are on the way.